I'm going to speak today about the formation of the Hispanic or Latino community of the United States. I wanted to follow basically three general themes. One is the establishment of the United States as the empire of the 20th century. Number two, the incorporation of Hispanic populations to the United States. And number three, the role of representation, that is the representation of U.S. Hispanics by writers and producers of television and film other than Hispanics, and then that image that they themselves create through their own writings and productions. In the first place, I think it is important to note that even though we tend to think of Hispanics as people who migrated to the United States, Hispanics have been in what is now the United States since before there was a United States. In fact, American history and American literature dawn in Spanish. They begin in Spanish, and they are a couple of centuries before the arrival of the British in Plymouth Rock. It is important to remember that there were early explorers from Spain who were in the American main. One of those explorers, there were a number of them, he's called Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, and the account, a book called The Account or Relación, is a book that was published recently in English in a new translation by the Recovery Project of Arte Público, and the editors and translators Martín Fabata and José Fernández had published the Spanish version earlier, I think in Studia Humanística in Washington, and they have now published it in English contemporarily. The interesting part about Cabeza de Vaca is that he explored the areas from Florida to Texas and back into what was New Spain, is now Mexico, and may have been in places like Galveston and Nacogdoches and places like that. And his account is very captivating because it's not an account of imperial, like we tend to think of Spaniards as people who come in with an army and they conquer and they impose their will. But in the case of Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, he talks in the first person and he talks about his experiences, his relation with the Indians. In some cases there was war, battles. In some cases there were friendly relations. And his account is very, as I said, very fetching because it is not the kind of account that we anticipate. It's, shall we say, counterintuitive. It is not what we expect. There were a number of texts published by Spaniards exploring what is now the American main, and they include also writings of what we could call beginnings of U.S. literature, although if you look at an American literary history, you will not find these texts reflected. Amongst them are an epic poem from 1610 called La Florida, about Florida, and another one, Historia de la Nueva México, also of the same date, maybe a year earlier, 1609 or 1610. And the Historia de la Nueva México, or History of the New Mexico, is a story written by Gaspar Pérez de Villagrá about an expedition that was sent from Mexico to Nueva Mexico, to New Mexico, to defend the town or recapture a town and defend some Spaniards who were left there and who were attacked by the Acoma Indians and the 34 cantos of this epic poem describe the terrible massacre that the Spaniards inflicted on the Indians in retribution for what they had done to the Spanish contingent that had been left behind. It is a literature that has reflects not only those terrible encounters between the native population and the European population, but there are also a number of texts that discuss or present the Spanish reality in the New World in the form of plays, in the form of ballads and poems, as well as accounts, stories, and relations, memoirs, letters, many of them self-serving letters trying to get something out of the king, but many of them are interesting accounts, ethnographic in their description of how the Indians lived, and there are enormous amounts of material dealing with Indian languages as well that Spaniards compiled. Yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt you here. I just wanted to ask you about the accounts, those ethnographic accounts. Were those from missionaries or were those from the explorers?
Both. Both. Some were from missionaries, some were from soldiers, and some were from not necessarily the leaders of the expeditions, but people who were there and who wrote. This is the case not only here, but in all of the New World. One of the interesting aspects of those accounts was the tremendous attention to nature, which European literature, the attention to nature up to that point had been very symbolic. If you had a garden, it was a scene of love, and if you had a wilderness, it was a scene of sin, and that's the way it was depicted. Whereas here we have a tremendous surprised eyes of these writers when they encounter nature, and their typical strategy is to enumerate with long lists all of the things that they see. One of the interesting topics is in this regard is what happened to Columbus when he was talking about the fish in the Caribbean Sea, and he wrote in his diary that había peces de colores. There were even colored fish in different colors. Of course, the Spaniards back home didn't believe this, and to this day, if you are in Spain and you tell a tall story, or what people believe to be a tall story, the answer will be, don't tell me about colored fish. No me hables de peces de colores. And this goes back to the Columbus diary, which tells you a little bit about the relationship between the nature and the discoverer, and nature as represented by the discoverers and the audience that read these books, because they did not quite believe what they were reading. The element of surprise, therefore, is in those lists. It is astonishing, surprising, and that is also the case of the Indians. But when we speak about the creation of the United States Hispanic population, even though the Southwest is very prominent and is a large part of it, the most important continuous areas where there has been a continuous presence of Hispanics has been in the Northeast and in the Southwest. The Southeast, that is Florida, there have been interruptions, not in the presence, but in the representation of that presence. Let's say the history of Florida has always been the weakest in the link. In the Northeast, the presence of Hispanics is noted primarily by the presence of Sephardim, that is the Jews that had come from Sepharad. Sepharad is the Hebrew word for Spain, and therefore Sephardic Jews are Spanish Jews. Much like Spain was also known during Roman times as Hispania, and before that as Iberia by Greeks, and it was also known as Al-Andalus by the Arabs. That's why Andalusia was southern Spain. And of course Sepharad was the way that the Hebrew word for the Jews who called Spain home. The Sephardic Jews that had settled in the Northeast, and they established themselves primarily as printers and bankers. The printers are an interesting group because it is becoming very clear now that they are the ones who printed the foundational documents of American history. Most of the documents that we know that were published and which we hold dear and important to American history were published in print shops by these people who were also publishing documents in Spanish. It's one of those interesting facts that has escaped us because we had not focused on it. If we put our optic and refocus our optic back and see that, then we can see that that line of thought continues throughout in the Northeast. We even have a Hispanic writing on the base of the Statue of Liberty. Emma Lazarus was a Sephardic Jew when she wrote, "Give me your tired, your poor, your for the immigrants." And this is something that this little poem that she wrote was very, very much part of what we consider American. And it is one of the Hispanic contributions to that Statue of Liberty, which was, of course, a French gift. The Hispanic population of the United States, though it has had uninterrupted presences in all three areas, and has had an interrupted presence in the Southeast with regard to self-representation, at least as far as we know, is nevertheless marked primarily by the incorporation of peoples officially into what is the United States. And that would be, the first group would be, of course, the people who were part of the Northeastern culture, the Sephardic. The second group would be the one incorporated in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and that would be the Mexican-American population of the Southwest, what is now the Southwest. It's a population that's very interesting. It's a population that was primarily of people sent from Mexico to colonize the North. And the colonization of the North implied first of all, fighting the Indians and establishing some kind of rule of law in which Mexican law would prevail, and before that, new Spanish law. Curiously, because Indians, for example, ate the tortillas, or the tortilla, as you know, means little tort, and little tort in Spain means an omelet. But in the New World, it means this flat bread made of corn, and which was eaten by Indians with beans and chiles and other edibles, tomatoes. And they also drank the chocolatl, or the chocolate tea, which was drunk not with milk. That was a European invention later, but the chocolate drunk with water. They came north, and they found that their food was similar to that of the Indians. And people are very funny. People want to always differentiate themselves from the people that they consider the other. And so immediately they invented a new kind of tortilla made with wheat flour instead of cornmeal. And the flour tortilla was born. I mean, so that we can get a notion of the fact that these two foods indicate both sameness in terms of type and difference in terms of ethnicity and purpose, that there was a presence that was at odds between the Indians and the Mexicans, or New Spaniards before, and then Mexicans later. And there was a certain amount of commonality, between them, but there was also a tremendous amount of difference. The population incorporated in 1848, therefore, is a population that is very proud. It's a population that has fought the Indians, has kept the land, where was a population of farmers and ranchers, and one that had fought very what they considered to be very ferocious tribes of Indians. Here we have then an incorporation of these people into the United States, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised to respect their whole land holdings and everything else. Of course, you know that this was not the case. That is, that the case is that with scams and with fraud and with all kinds manner of and force sometimes, they were able to Anglophones who moved west were able to take over most of the land that was owned by Mexicans, now Mexican Americans. If you look deeply through Mexican American literature, through Chicano literature, you will find that many of the buried themes and difficult topics are always land holding is very important. That is, the land that was taken away and that one tries to recuperate. As was mentioned earlier, Amparo Ruiz de Burton, in her Squatter and the Dawn, discusses this very issue with California, and there were other people who have discussed it throughout in Hispanic literature all the way to our day. It is the loss of land that meant the loss of prestige, the loss of power, the loss of the possibility of keeping one's culture from being dissolved in many ways, and one having to adopt new ways. The presence of Hispanics in the United States for 50 years remained that of Mexican Americans, and to a great extent the hidden population up north, which is the Sephardic Jewry. The incorporation of other Hispanic parts of the world to the United States came after 1898. In 1898, interestingly, the United States, which had fought that tremendous civil war in the 1860s and had done all it could to colonize the West, was basically creating, in fact, it created somewhere natural discoveries like the gold rush was part, of course, of the discovering of gold in California, which drove people from the impoverished East to what they perceived to be the rich West. And in other cases, it was a very specific policy of the government, such as the 1862 Land Grant Act, which allowed people to take over a certain amount of land if they were able to stake it out and work it. The policies such as the Land Grant Act and events such as the gold rush of 1848 in California created a tremendous impetus of movement from east to west. And one of the arguments in one of the theses written in Madrid many years ago with by an American student was that he was looking at a geopolitical explanation of why Mexico lost its north to the United States westward expansion. And his thesis is that because Spain had earlier ceded in some ways and through some convolutions both Florida and Louisiana, and they ended up in U.S. hands, the westward sweep began very low, very much in the southern areas of the east, and so when it went west, it didn't stay north of Mexico, it went right through. Others cite Texas, of course, and the Texas case. The independence of Texas is very important in this regard. But whatever happened, what happened was that as that westward expansion moved, with the engine called Manifest Destiny, a racial and spiritual thesis of territorial imperatives was that engine moved west, and the people who were in its path were pretty much brushed aside, and whatever they owned was taken and given proper title to it. The other element, of course, of the development of the West has to do with the railroad, and the railroad, as we know, always is not only a transportation issue, but one of land development. When you put a railroad through or you open a road, if you're a speculator in land, you know that wherever that road goes, the land on either side is going to be richer than the land that is not by the road. So the development of the railroad to the west became an important consideration in the westward expansion of the United States. It also incorporated the Chinese coolies who were brought for working in the railroads and were incorporated also into the American population and the American culture, at least in general terms, although not specifically acknowledged. One of the things that is important in 1898, therefore, is that the United States had achieved this westward expansion and was looking south. There had been a great many adventures followed by the government in Washington, but at the moment in which the newspapers in the Northeast begin to take notice of expansion towards the Caribbean, the presidents of the United States and all the leaders of the United States were very aware of the tremendous recession that was going through from 1893 to 1897, and which led people to speak about the taste of blood was in the lips of the taste of empire was like the taste of blood in the middle of the jungle. And it was a quote often repeated by military and civilian leaders of the U.S. because they realized that there was tremendous costs to expansionism. And the expansion west had been well worth it because there had been many resources incorporated, including human resources, may I add, into the United States, and that was important with the loss of slavery as a labor force, or forced labor. 1898, therefore, is an interesting time. It's a time when 50 years had passed between the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and now the U.S. is, in a way, forced by its own impetus and forced by its own press. It was the battling between Pulitzer and Hearst, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, which led to the Spanish-American War. They were the New York World, which was the Pulitzer newspaper, and the New York Journal, the William Randolph Hearst newspaper, had invented something called yellow journalism, and it was in order to sell more newspapers, they were attempting to fill the front pages of newspapers with sensational stories. They put crime, and they put very graphic photographs and big headlines calling the attention of people to that newspaper and enticing them to buy it. One of the strategies followed by William Randolph Hearst was that of incorporating a series of stories that were connected to people in Cuba who had been abused by the Spanish government. And by doing this, Hearst was able to not only keep the attention of people on the sensational story, but also to create a chain in which every day he would report a little bit more, reveal another fact, other pictures, and created a sort of a real soap opera, that is a soap opera not about fictional characters but about real characters. Even though these characters were real, however, he would fictionalize them. That is, he would add, exaggerate their attributes and the events themselves. He was so intent on getting the United States involved that when he sent his foreign correspondents and they said there's no war here in the Caribbean, he was quoted as having said, "You write the news, I'll put the war. I'll take care of the war, and you take care of the news." And of course, the most sensational story is a story that our earlier speaker is working on. It's a story about a young woman named Evangelina Cisneros, and her story is being prepared for the recovery project by Dr. Lynn Cortina. Here was an interesting case of a woman, a young woman, who was presented to the American public as a girl. I don't know if we can capture her picture here, but she was a stunner. She was a very beautiful, very attractive woman, and Evangelina became the centerpiece of Hearst's campaigns. And story after story came out, and she had, of course, he had the best people. He had other pictures of her. This one is much later when she met McKinley after being rescued. It's a story of daring do. And this newspaper man, Carl Decker, who used to work for Hearst, was sent to Havana to help Evangelina escape prison. Now, Evangelina's story is complicated, but suffice it to say that she had helped her father, and she was a grandniece, I think is the correct way of saying it, of a man who had been president of Cuba in exile, that is, or in arms, the Republic in arms, and was fighting the Spaniards. And so the Hearst newspaper painted her as some kind of a princess, a woman who grew up with finery and who is now being thrown into this jail with this tough women prisoners who were going to do this and that to her. And so he really went into a frenzy and got Evangelina to become an important part of his strategy of getting the U.S. involved in Cuba. And I wanted to show you one more thing about that before. And this is done by the artist. Let's see. This is. Let's see if she's here. Yeah, there's some woodcuts that were done about the insurrection, then some soldiers, then there's the Evangelina, and here is the story pretty well summarized. She is saved through a ladder put through the roof, and then she has to open a bar, go through a jail, dressed like a sailor, and she's then gets into a boat that gets her to the United States. What's interesting about the story is, in addition to the story itself, is that it was used exaggeratedly. That is, all the elements were exaggerated, and Hearst used it to coax women all over the United States to become involved in freeing Evangelina. And the first ladies of every state were the first signatories in petitions that filled pages and pages with names in very tiny print. There were the First Lady of the United States now also appealed to the Pope and appealed to the regent, Queen Regent in Spain, to free Evangelina. It was a big show, and eventually, when he had public opinion on his side, he was able to. Some people claim that Hearst was responsible for the Maine explosion. Some people say no, that wasn't the case. There were other people. But what was interesting is that when the battleship Maine does arrive in Havana Harbor, at the request of Fitzhugh Lee, the American consul, to protect American property, as soon as the white officers were off the ship and only the black sailors were left, they were eating dinner at the city of Washington, another battleship that was in the port. The Maine blew up and sank, and sank in Havana Harbor. Many attempted to find out what happened, and there were several who were able to look at the hull, but eventually the United States took it and dropped it into one of the deepest parts of the Pacific, so that there's no way now to find out exactly what happened with the battleship Maine. What is interesting is that, and what is important is that the press pushed the United States into war with Spain, and it became the Splendid Little War, and this is what it was called. It was called that. It would lasted just a few battles, and one of them was the battle in Santiago de Cuba Harbor, in which the Rivera, the admiral who had come from Cape Verde Islands in the African coast, tried to defend the harbor. The Americans had blocked the harbor and were able to caught the Pereira ships inside and were able to shoot them one by one. I mean, it was a shooting fish in a barrel. And the Cubans had pretty much won the war in the land when Teddy Roosevelt showed up with his Rough Riders, and they charged San Juan Hill, and of course there were a lot of dead. There were about 1,000 people died in that battle, and Stephen Crane, an American writer who reported for the Pulitzer World, claimed that the Americans were scared, and Roosevelt was furious. He was in a rage because nobody could say that his Rough Riders were scared. And of course they were scared because there was a crossfire between the Spanish forces had positioned themselves on two sides of the hill and were shooting and killed a great many of both Cubans and Americans. The war was interesting because it made possible for the United States to pick up Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. Cuba became independent because of tremendous pressure from the Cubans themselves and from world opinion, which was, of course, Hearst. He had his own shot. I mean, his own gun shot him in the backwards toward him as he fired the shot towards the Spaniards. He also created a problem for himself because now everybody in the world was very much aware of what was going on, and that the United States was there to help the Cubans, not to take them over. This was not the case with Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, there had only been about less than a dozen dead, and the Puerto Ricans had Nelson Miles, who was the American general who went to take it over. Nelson Miles had been famous in the Indian Wars in the United States. The Indians called him Bearcoat because they knew him from so many encounters. And Miles had an easy time. He went in there, and as I said, there were, some claim 4, some claim 8, let's say less than a dozen dead, very few dead in comparison to the Cuban side. And the United States ended up with Puerto Rico and the Philippines as reparations of war. Cuba ended up free, but with a Platt Amendment in its constitution, which allowed the United States to intervene at any time that they didn't like what was going on. This went on until through the 30s. And they intervened in Cuba at least two times, took out the government, put their own governor, and so forth. So the Cubans were in this in-between republic. They were sort of independent. The Puerto Ricans were not. They were part of the U.S., and the Philippines became part of the U.S. The Philippines, of course, was named for Philip II, as you know. And Philip II was a Spanish king, son of Charles V. All of a sudden, we now have an incorporation of populations from Cuba, from Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Although there had been Cubans in Florida and in New York prior to the war, it became very important now to see the war as an opening of the floodgates of Puerto Ricans. And Puerto Ricans were in a situation that was very difficult between 1898 and 1917, the year that they became citizens of the United States. The United States made Puerto Ricans citizens in 1917 because they were trying to get people to go to war in Europe with the First World War, and they needed conscripts. So they made Puerto Rico immediately a place to recruit soldiers. And by making them American citizens, gave them the opportunity to serve in Europe. So we have now in 1898 the completion of what would be the main four groups that made up the American Hispanic community, the community that incorporated Spaniards, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans, in that order, in terms of chronology, and I should say Cubans and Puerto Ricans, and then in terms of numbers, it was, of course, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Spaniards. That is in a descending order of how much population there was in the U.S. Always the Mexican American group represents about 60 to 70%, depending on the time, and Puerto Ricans about 20, 25, 30%, depending on when, and the Cubans always in the 5% range, and the Spanish in a trace, less than 1%, including amongst whom are the Sephardim. The American Hispanic community now, in 1898, incorporates from 50 years before the Mexicans and all the other three groups. And for a while, the Filipinos. Remember that the Filipinos were Spanish-speaking people, and until recently, when Tagalog became the official language and only the upper classes in the Philippines speak Spanish. Although you will find Filipino names are Spanish last names many times, Valdez or Rodriguez and so forth, and you find out that they don't speak Spanish anymore. And that's because they speak Tagalog or English, or they're bilingual, Tagalog English. But if you see Imelda Marcos and the Marcos family, the people who ran for the Philippines were obviously Spanish speakers. And that's been true in more recent history, the last 25, 35 years. The population has become more Americanized, and the Vietnam War helped enormously in that regard, in that American troops were always stationed there. But this was for a while an important Hispanic population in the United States. What happens with this Hispanic population? I think that we have heard earlier from Professor Mintz that this has been a population that has been ignored in the history books. It has been ignored in the literature books, in the histories of literature, and it has been ignored in the most important media, which are the broadcast media and the film media, because it is the popular media, the one that makes the images of history real. Some people claim that about Reagan. When President Reagan was used to make allusions to history in his speeches, many people discovered at the time that his allusions were not to actual events, but to movies that had been made about those events. So that if the president could do it, certainly I think that we can expect that the general population would do that. As a matter of fact, therefore, it is important to, when you look at the record of publications about Hispanics, that there are two facts that are very salient. The first one is that they're not there, and the second one is that if they're there, they're stereotypically portrayed. So it becomes important when one looks at the Hispanic population of the United States to take a quick look at self-representation. I've mentioned the word before, and I want to reiterate the word because it's an important idea. That is, it is not an idea that of seeing how Hispanics have been represented, but how Hispanics represent themselves, that we can get a better sense of what we're talking about. Let me give you one specific example of problems when you talk about the representation of Hispanics by Hispanics. The American publishing industry has, for a long time, glorified, stimulated, and in fact demanded that whenever an immigrant writes a novel, that the novel be an ethnic immigrant novel. And ethnic autobiographies, as they're called, are an immigrant novel in which two things happen. The first is that the speaker, the subject, writes about him or herself in a way in which his or her life story is told, and two terms are juxtaposed and in fact contraposed. That is, they're put in contraposition one to the other. The first one is the home from where they come is always seen as poor or backward or in any kind of negative way, and the United States is seen as the land of opportunity, the land of realization for people, of progress, and so forth. So between these two poles of a negative view of the home and a very positive view of the U.S., the passage from the home country to the U.S. has to be a passage from bad to good. And of course, it's the model that was used was the rags to riches model, which allowed then people to see themselves as having achieved progress. Progress, as you know, is one of the great biases of historiography. In historiography, there are two main biases. The first one is the myth of the Golden Age, where if you hear Indian historians talk to you, you will hear, or Indians talking about the history of their people. You will always hear that things were better in the past, and that things have been very bad since the white man came, and they're getting worse, and so forth. That declining view of history is the myth of the Golden Age, and the ascendant view, that is that everything is getting better and we're moving towards a better tomorrow, is the myth of progress. And the myth of progress, so much a part of the 19th century, was reduplicated in the 20th century under a new name, baptized under the name of development. And what was progress in the 19th century became development in the 20th. And people have been expected always to develop themselves, to find progress, whatever. And ethnic autobiography has been the means by which publishing houses have demanded that people incorporate themselves and mark their incorporation as one of going from bad to better. It's important that we see that not only we have people who write authentically about their group, and that we have people who write nothing about the group and people who do write about it, but also the fact that there are people in the group that are demanded to write in a specific way about the group. That is, when you look at the history of literature and the history of the U.S. and the history of American literature, both you will see the absence of Hispanics in those texts. Then you will see when people do write about Hispanics, a stereotypical view. And one of the important things about the Spanish-American War, if I may go back to that for 1 minute, is that in the Spanish-American War, not only was it propelled by Hertz and Pulitzer, but there were 500. This is a little war. That splendid little war. And that splendid little war had 500 foreign correspondents on the scene, as many as there were in Vietnam. Vietnam was a heck of a lot bigger war in terms of duration, in terms of number of dead, in terms of importance, and so forth. So between the Spanish-American War and the Vietnam War, we have a very similar number of correspondents. So it was an important part of the war. In fact, the War of Mexico already had correspondents and had a very ingenious way of delivering the news. The news were delivered by Pony Express, what was called a Kendall Express. They were then taken by steamboat and so forth. And it arrived from steam to the Pony Express to the New Orleans Picayune in 2 days' time, sometimes in 2 weeks' time, depending on whether it was a more normal time. If they couldn't get the ship fast enough, everything worked perfectly. In 2 days' time, you could have the news report for the Mexican War in 1840s to the New Orleans Picayune editor's desk, but normally with 2 weeks. And what was presented in those war stories were sketches of soldiers fighting and so forth. And besides the sketches, there were a number of paintings or pictures that depicted what was going on, graphs and so forth. In the Spanish-American War, we have photographs and you have stories. You have tremendous number of important writers. I mentioned Stephen Crane. I should mention also, and I think Professor Mentos mentioned O. Henry, who later ended up writing about Honduras. The writer, a few years later in the Mexican Revolution of 1910, it would be Ambrose Bierce, who became famous now with Old Gringo, the movie that was made, and the book based on the book by Fuentes, and Decker, who of course I showed his picture, was the one who rescued Evangelina out of jail in Spain. All of these were newspaper writers, and they were all over, and they were writing about Evangelina, or about the war, or about the Rough Riders, as Crane did. The writers in the United States, of course, would write about primarily the glory of the United States in this war, and the poor showing of Spain in the contest. It became part of the flow south that started with reporters, and which included figures like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I mean, people who went south looking for gold, and many other adventurers who would follow that route. But in the United States, the population of the United States that was Hispanic was pretty much ignored, in marginalized, and simply became invisible, was rendered invisible. The curious thing about this is that when we look at how do these people exist, what happened to them, we have to go to their publications. And the most important thing that we have to find is that the newspaper, which had been so important in depicting the events of incorporation, that is, the events by which the U.S. took the territory of Mexico or took the territory of Spain in the Caribbean and in Asia, was the very vehicle that would be used by Hispanics to control their own self-representation. The first newspaper that we have any news of was published in 1808 in Louisiana. Here is a picture of it. It was published, as you will see, in Spanish, and let's see if we can have the camera. There it is. Sorry. El Mississippi, which is the Spanish for the Mississippi. That's miércoles, that is Wednesday, the 12th of October of 1808. And the 12th of October, as you know, is the day of Dia de la Raza, or Columbus Day, which is an important. This newspaper was published, as you can see, in Spanish, and it was published also in French and in English. It was a trilingual newspaper. And it became the first of many that would become the source of stories about Hispanics, written by Hispanics in the United States. From those newspapers, we are able to find not only the events and the characters, but also the literary expression. Many times they became the vehicles for writing literature, poems, stories, serialized novels, plays, and they begin in that manner. The story of Joaquin Murieta, which was mentioned earlier by Professor Mintz. Joaquin Murieta was the so-called social bandit, later adopted by Chileans as their own. The Chileans think that, in fact, Neruda, the poet, the Nobel Prize winning poet, has been quoted as saying that Murieta is Chileno. And of course, Murieta was no more Chileno than the Man in the Moon. Murieta was a bandit, so-called, from the Santa Barbara area. It was published in Santa Barbara in the newspaper for the first time, in La Gaceta, the Gazette, in 1881. And that novel about Murieta's life was serialized in that newspaper. It's important that you see that the presence of newspapers in the telling of the story, and also the fact that in newspapers, the founding of newspapers will give you a sense of how the community went. In California, for example, the public clamor, el clamor público, and La Estrella de Los Ángeles, the Los Angeles Star, had been issued in the 1850s. La Crónica, or the Chronicle, from the 70s to the 90s, and San Francisco's La Voz del Nuevo Mundo, the Voice of the New World, La Sociedad, Society, and La Cronista, the Chronicler, the female chronicler, and La República, the Republic, they were published in the last 4 decades of the century, that is from the 1860s to 1900s. In New Mexico, El Clarín Mexicano, the Mexican Clarion, and El Fronterizo, the Frontier, in the 1870s. El Nuevo Mexicano, the New Mexican, from the 1850s to the turn of the century, was a long run. And El Defensor del Pueblo, the People's Defender, in the 1890s, were all important vehicles for Southwestern newspapers. Amongst Texas contributions during this period were the San Antonio's El Bejareño, the Bejar County, during the 1850s, El Paso's Las Dos Américas, the Two Americas, in the 1890s, and El Clarín del Norte, the Northern Clarion, in the 1900s. These are a few examples of what were literally hundreds of newspapers that provided the cultural enrichment and entertainment of the Mexican-American communities. They provided information while helping to foster solidarity within the community and defending the rights of Mexican Americans in the face of the growing influence of Anglo-American culture. During the latter part of the 19th century, there were several authors that have been mentioned by Professor Lynn Cortina, earlier, Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton, and and so forth, which began writing in English, but for the most part, these newspapers were written in Spanish. There was also Charles Rudolph's Los Vilitos of 1880, which was funded by, was found in New Mexico by the WPA, the Writers Project, which WPA was one of the agencies of the Depression that was funded by Roosevelt's programs. Workers Project Administration, I think it's the WPA. In New Mexico also we can find a pastoral novel like Gervasio y Aurora, o sea, la historia de un caminante, the history of a traveler on foot, or Gervasio and Aurora, which paints a colorful picture, kind of romantic picture of New Mexico at the period. Eusebio Chacon, another New Mexican in the 1892, published two short novels celebrated today. One is El Hijo de la Tempestad, Child of the Storm, and Tras la Tormenta de la Calma, the calm after the storm. New Mexican Miguel Ángel Otero issued a 3-volume English language autobiography, My Life on the Frontier, published in 1935, in which he gives an account of his life spanning from age 5 until the period immediately following his term as governor of New Mexico, and which ended in 1906. Also, you have in all of those newspapers a number of poets who publish poetry, and although a lot of the poetry, some of it can be traced to their ancestral home, some of it is new poetry that's written about the experience in the United States. Amongst the most frequently featured poets in many of these newspapers were Texan Montalban. We don't know his first name is E. period, so we don't know if it's Ernesto or Enrique or what. Montalban in El Bejareño, in the Bejar County newspaper. Felipe Maximiliano Chacón and Julio Flores in New Mexico papers, and Dantes, you're going by one name, Dantes, in Santa Barbara's La Gaceta. One of the most interesting poets of the turn of the century was, again mentioned by Dr. Lynn Cortina, was Sara Estela Ramirez, who published her poems and some speeches in Laredo's La Crónica, in the Chronicle, and El Demócrata, the Democrat, and in her own literary periodicals, La Corregidora, the Corrector, and Aurora, between the years 1904 and 1910. In her life, as well as in her literary works, Ramirez was an activist for the Mexican Liberal Party in its movement to overthrow dictator Porfirio Diaz, which of course was done with the Mexican Revolution of 1910. And she also fought for workers' and women's rights. One of the big projects that took place in the 1870s was a project that you should know about. It was done by Hubert H. Bancroft. In attempting to put together the documents for a history of California, Bancroft, who had made enormous amounts of money, was able to hire Enrique Cerruti and Thomas Savage. And these two went around interviewing people, and what's important about it is that many of the people interviewed were people who were not able to read or write. So their stories come to us by virtue of these interviews, and historical figures like Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, Antonio Coronel, and Pío Pico are also preserved together with Eulalia Perez, or many women who were, of course, particularly subject to this business of not being literate, their life stories were saved. Amongst them, Eulalia Perez, I mentioned, Una vieja y sus recuerdos, 1877, An Old Lady and Her Memories. Apolinaria Lorenzana's Memorias de Doña Apolinaria Lorenzana la Devota, the Devout, memories of memoirs of the Devout. And Juana Madrado La Lipaz de Wrightingtons, Los Tiempos Pasados de la Alta California, the years past in Upper California. Remember, California would be always upper and lower, and that was also true after the division by the two countries, among some 40 others. So there were about 50 or so of these interviews. And recently there has been a book published studying them by Rosaura Sanchez of the University of California, San Diego. And she published two books. One in which she does collect these biographies, and the other one in which she studies the biographies themselves. This is a commentary of how they're done. These are remarkable literary documents because their clarity, their eloquence of expression, as well as their analysis of gender relations in California society, and for these women, the gestures of self-empowerment when they tell the stories. As you know, there's also been a number of documents of the same type found by the Recovery Project with regard to judicial documents. That is, where women who ended up widows had to declare, had to give statements, depositions that they were in fact married to this gentleman and their children, and then were entitled to the property that in which they lived, particularly their home and so forth. And many of these documents found in the juzgados, or juzgaos, as they used to say in the Old West, that is the courthouses, are again biographies dictated to a scribe in the courthouse who wrote them down as part of the deposition, and you can find their voices, sometimes very much pretty clear voices about what they were about. During the 19th century, in the New York and Philadelphia area, there were various Hispanic literary activities sustained, as well as cultural institutions. Here again, the newspapers played an important part because this was a population that principally contained Spaniards and Cubans. Such newspapers as El Mensajero Semanal or El Habanero, which is the earliest Cuban newspaper, 1824, the Havanan, El Mensajero Semanal, and the weekly El Mercurio de Nueva York were both published in the 20s and 30s. And they basically issued news of the homeland, political commentary and poetry, short stories, essays, and excerpts of plays. Three other early newspapers were La Crónica, the Chronicle, La Voz de América, the Voice of America, and La Revolución, the Revolution. And all of them appeared in the 1850s to the 1860s. The first Puerto Rican periodical to appear was La Voz de Puerto Rico in 1874. So first you see from the Cubans, 1824, and the Puerto Ricans, 1874. So it's a pretty big span of time, and you can see then the presence of both populations, how they relate in terms of incorporation. Not officially, but of people there here already. Amongst the poets published at this time were Miguel Teurbe Tolón, who was born in the United States and educated in Cuba. So he was born here, went there, was educated, and later became a conspirator of Cuban independence for Cuban independence from Spain. And he, with another group of poets, some of whom were annexationists, published a book which the Recovery Project again has reissued, edited by Matías Montes Huidobro. It's called El Laúd del Desterrado, or the Exiles' Lute, and it was published in 1858 in New York. It is one of the first books of poetry in Spanish, but not as early as the one published in 1828, 30 years earlier, by a Mexican, Anastasio Ochoa Acuña, called Poesías de un Mexicano, Poems of a Mexican, and that was also published in New York. And so that you could see, again, by in the 1820s, you had Spaniards, you had Cubans, but you also had Mexicans published in New York. That is, New York had become a cosmopolitan Hispanic community. And nowadays, in our day, many people want to separate these groups and drive wedges between them, and it is very easy to do because obviously they come from different parts of the Hispanic world, and they have different ideologies sometimes about and different political persuasions, but basically culturally they have shared the same experience, and they have all had to adapt to life in this country. The late 19th century, however, is very important because the newspapers and the magazines and book publishing began to expand, principally as a result of increased immigration, and also because of the ferment of political and cultural activity, associated with Cuban, Puerto Rican, and Dominican independence movements and the Spanish-American War. Now, when we get to the Spanish-American War, we see it from the other side. How was this reported by the Hispanic press in the United States? And of course, it's a very different story than the one that was published in American newspapers like the New York World and the New York Journal. In newspapers like El Separatista, the Separatist, El Porvenir, the Future, or Borinquen, about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico's name in the Indian language of the natives of Puerto Rico, which are the Arawaks, the language is called Taíno, and the Taíno word for Puerto Rico is Borinquen. In the late 1880s and 1890s. The most noteworthy institution of this time was a Cuban newspaper called La Patria, called the Fatherland, in whose pages can be found essays by the leading Cuban and Puerto Rican patriots. In addition, numerous essays, letters, diaries, poems, short stories, and literary works by some of Puerto Rico's most important literary and patriotic figures were written in New York while they worked for the Revolution. Among these were Eugenio María de Hostos. Hostos was an important figure in the creation of Puerto Rico. I mean, one of the foundational thinkers. Ramón Emeterio Betances, who was a revolutionary. Sotero Figueroa and Lola Rodriguez de Tio, mentioned also by Dr. Lynn Cortina earlier. And all of them, of course, were fighters for the revolution, and Lola was particularly known for her poetry as well. Active in the, as well in literature and political activist circles were revolutionary leaders Francisco González Pachín Marín, known as Pachín Marín, if you heard of Puerto Ricans, and also leaders like José Martí. I think I have a photograph of Martí here, which you can see it from the, let's see if I find it. The photograph of Martí will give you an idea of what all these people sort of look like. Let's see if I find it. Here he is. This is the typical portrait of the time, and Martí was known as a Cuban apostle of independence, but curiously, he may have been Cuban, but he lived in New York 15 years and published all his work in New York practically, and wrote in New York, and his poetry, and some of you know some of his lyrics from the song Guantanamera, I mean, which contains some of his verses. He didn't write it for the song; it was incorporated later by other people. I think it was Pete Seeger in the United States. Martí was an international figure. He led 34 of the associations of the Cuban Revolutionary Party in the Northeast, Florida, and Jamaica. And many of these published their own periodicals, and he published in all of them. He was an international literary figure, as I said, in his own right. His writings are still studied by today in Latin American literature classes throughout the world. and he has left a legacy of numerous essays and other writings that relate directly to his life in New York and elsewhere in the United States. And in fact, he became an interpreter for Latin American readers about what was going on in the U.S. So you will find articles about a new bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, or Sunday in Central Park, Sunday picnic in Central Park, that kind of thing was, in addition to figures, important figures of the day, and his sort of, they weren't biographies exactly, but his impressions of these figures and what, yes.
It would be interesting to be able to read some of those interpretations. Do you know where we might be able to find some English translations?
Yes, there are a couple of volumes of Marti's writings that you can find in the library. I don't know, I haven't checked this library, but I know that they have been out, and I'm pretty sure that we have a copy of Marti's writings in English, and he has some interesting views about. Of course, he was the one who coined the label Nuestra America, our America, because, as you know, there has always been a dispute amongst Hispanic peoples and with the American people about the use of the word America, which the United States, everybody's America, but the United States, by calling themselves the United States of America, pretty much took away the right of other people to call themselves Americans. And so Martí talks about Nuestra America, our America, as opposed to that America, the official U.S. Well, let me conclude this section because I think it's important to go ahead and finish. Francisco González Pachín Marín, I mentioned before, a typesetter by trade, was publisher of El Postillon newspaper in New York, and the Postillon. It was previously closed down by the censor in Puerto Rico. He's an important figure in Puerto Rican poetry because of his initiative to break with Romanticism in terms of, well, the poetry of Puerto Rico was very romantic until very late in the 19th century. So he's left not only that legacy of breaking with Romanticism, but also an important essay called Nueva York por dentro, una faz de su vida bohemia. New York on the inside, one facet of its bohemian life, in which he sketches New York from the perspective of a disillusioned immigrant. This is perhaps the earliest document in Spanish that takes this point of view and can perhaps be considered the beginning of a Hispanic immigrant literature. In New York, Pachín Marín also published his noted volume Romances or Ballads in 1892. Sotero Figueroa, a typographer and owner of the Imprenta America, America's print shop, was a publisher of numerous exiled documents of the magazine El Americano, The American, edited by a Venezuelan named Figueredo. Sotero Figueroa was one of the principal writers for the Revista Ilustrada, the Illustrated Review, and in New York he also published his book on Spanish-American literature, Reparos Literarios, Literary Observations. It should be literary criticisms, because they were not just criticism as literary criticism, but it was criticizing, being negatively critical. Reparos. Another distinguished political figure to take exile in New York was Luis Munoz Rivera, founding in 1901 that city's first Hispanic newspaper published in English and Spanish. It was called the Puerto Rico Herald. Also of importance as the most widely circulated weekly was Las Novedades of 1893 to 1918, Las Novedades de News, whose theater, music, and literary critic was a noted Dominican writer and literary critic Pedro Enriquez Ureña. Enriquez Ureña and his brother Max Enriquez Ureña were also great educators, and Pedro's books have been one of the mainstays of Latin American culture in the U.S. In Latin America as well. Another early Puerto Rican contribution was La Gaceta Ilustrada, the illustrated gazette edited in the 1890s by writer Francisco Ami, like Amy, write it like A-M-Y. Many of the Spanish-language literary books published in New York were also related to the Cuban independence struggle, such as Luis García Pérez El Grito de Yara, or The Shout at Yara, 1879, and Desiderio Fajardo Ortiz's La Fuga de Evangelina, 1898, The Escape of Evangelina, talking about Evangelina Cisneros, the woman that had been rescued by Decker at Harce's behest from a Spanish jail in Havana. The 20th century, we can pretty much divide into two general parts, and the first part is the most interesting, has to do with the presence of Mexican exiles for the first time. In Mexican population of the United States up to that time was the population of the incorporated in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but now you have Mexican who arrive from Mexico because of the political exile, and they also created a flood of newspapers and of publishing in the Southwest. And it's not only to the Chicano movement in the 1960s and early 70s that you also have another flood, which is the one that you and I live with today. I think that this pretty much concludes a kind of overview of what has been the story of the Hispanics and their self-representation in the United States. Thanks.